In this video, I'm going to talk more about China and the Cold War in Asia. So we start with China in 1949. The Civil War has ended. The Chinese communists have won. They've come to power. They inherit a country that's been devastated by Japanese invasions and by this long period of civil war and unrest. And the goal of Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese communists, is going to be kind of like Stalin's goal was to industrialize China. He sees industrialization as the only way that China can compete with the West. So it's not just about dividing everything equally, it's about showing that communism will provide more material wealth than Western liberalism will. And so Mao tries to industrialize China, tries to increase the industrialization of China with a program called the Great Leap Forward. And the idea behind the Great Leap Forward is to reduce the number of Chinese peasants who are working on the farms in order to move a large number of peasants to industrial labor. And in the end, as one of the videos that I've posted explains in more detail, becomes a great failure. That the peasants who are working on the land want to show the Chinese government that they're being successful, and so they claim that they're achieving these very high quotas that the Chinese government is setting. And then the Chinese government thinks this is great, we can move people off the land and have them working day and night trying to create factories and railroads and industrialize China. And what ends up happening is you have massive food shortages and a horrific famine in which 30 million people die. And you have these awful accounts of people eating earth to try and survive, and the earth just destroying their intestines. And either they die that way or they die from hunger. And so the Great Leap Forward is a great failure for Communist China. And Mao's reaction to this failure is that the reason the failure took place must be because there are still people inside Chinese society who are working against communism. This is kind of the definition of an ideology. When it doesn't work, you assume it's because there are enemies at work, not because there's something wrong with the ideology. And so in concern that there are still these enemies of communism in Chinese society, Mao launches what's known as the Cultural Revolution, in which he puts together bands of young people and encourages them to go out into China and destroy any remaining vestiges of ancient China, or anything that symptomizes the previous age of the world according to the communist theory of history. Remember when I talked about the communist theory of history way back when we were talking about 19th century thought and ideas. The idea is that you have these periods of class conflict and oppression before the new class takes over. Now we're supposed to be entering this classless utopia for Mao, and so he sends these groups of young students out there to destroy any remnants of the previous class. And so these young bands of young people tear down symbols of ancient China, ancient architecture, they change street names. All of these are seen as repressive. And there's this phrase that's used to struggle against these repressive aspects of ancient China. But really what struggle against means is to attack these things, to attack ancient Buddhist temples, to attack teachers and intellectuals who were seen as representatives of the old order, and they were struggled against. But really it means they were beaten up. And we have these accounts of mobs of teenagers who are beating old men and old women with their belts. Many people die. And in the end, as you might imagine, even the mobs of students get out of control and they start fighting with one another. And in the end, Mao has to call in the army to repress these students, and China continues to exist under military repression. Mao dies in 1976. Only 3 years later, the Communist Party of China declared that the Great Leap Forward had been a failure. We move away from China now to talk about Vietnam. This time we're talking about an American failure rather than a failure of communism. Vietnam had been a province of the French colonial empire, or colony of the French colonial empire. The French had been driven out, and the country had been divided between, kind of like Korea, a northern half and a southern half. And the Americans provide support for the South when they see that the northern communist half is trying to take over South Vietnam. The Americans provide them with financial support and then with military support, first in the form of airstrikes. But the airstrikes are not very effective, and they lose the Americans a lot of sympathy. And then the Americans put troops on the ground. And this, in many ways, becomes an unwinnable war. The Americans are fighting in territory that's quite hostile. The American military isn't designed as sort of a giant police force to lock down the whole country of Vietnam, even if that had been possible in the jungles and the difficult terrain of the country. What makes it more difficult for the American military to be successful is that this is the first war that's being broadcast on television, and people are still trying to work out how to do this. So I've included a clip which doesn't really explain much about the Vietnamese War, but it's just a clip from one of the major news networks, and it shows people being shot at. And this was very traumatic for Americans to see this over their dinners or when they're watching the nightly news. And so public support for American involvement in the war starts to dissipate. And eventually the Americans pull out, South Vietnam collapses, and is taken over by communist North Vietnam. Postscript to talking about the Cold War in East Asia is Chinese integration with the West. This is seen as a great surprise at the time, but in retrospect has been seen as something of a diplomatic masterstroke. President Nixon went to China, re-established diplomatic relations with China, not as far as we know, because he particularly liked the Chinese and he particularly liked Chinese communism, but it drew the Chinese out of an alliance with the Soviet Union that could have been really lethal for the West. Chinese manpower, Soviet technology, and so Nixon is kind of trying to pry China away from Russia. And so and this happens in 1972, and for the next 40, 45 years, you see China just become more and more integrated into the global society, the global economy that I am going to talk about next week. And China remains a one-party state where political freedom is not possible. But it remains, but it becomes more of a capitalist economy. And relations, the cheap labor that China provides is very good for the American consumer markets. And vice versa. American consumer markets are great for, as you can see, a struggling Chinese economy. And so economically speaking, this is very beneficial both for China and their trading partners. And it leads to a certain amount of silence, or really a lot of silence, on the part of the rest of the world where it comes to human rights abuses that are taking place in China.